Japan's new Prime Minister Takai shocked Beijing in parliament when she declared that, if something happens to Taiwan, it could constitute a survival crisis for Japan. That single sentence instantly ignited the Chinese regime's most sensitive nerve. Very quickly, the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, copied its usual political warfare playbook used on Taiwan and applied it directly to Japan. The Chinese consul general in Osaka, Xue went online and threatened to cut off that filthy head of Takai. Beijing then suspended imports of Japanese seafood, launched a full-scale campaign to discourage Chinese citizens from traveling to Japan, ordered state-owned airlines to cancel flights, and most absurdly, even demanded that Japan's Prime Minister step down. When a regime dares to demand the resignation of the democratically elected leader of another country, this is no longer a normal diplomatic dispute, but a blatant step across the red line into interference in internal affairs. Yet what Beijing did not anticipate is that Japanese society was not intimidated at all. Rather than backing down, public support for Takai surged. The United States, Singapore, and other countries also stepped forward quickly to support Japan, turning the CCP's wolf warrior stance into a global laughingstock. This raises a series of questions. Why did Beijing ratchet up its rhetoric to such an unprecedented level? With the Chinese military plagued by corruption, the economy sliding downward, and internal political storms constantly brewing, does it really dare to go head-to-head with Japan, where American troops are permanently stationed? And when Japan refuses to apologize or retreat, how can the CCP walk back its own all-out escalation without losing face? After its war of words failed to have the desired effect, Beijing moved on to its familiar, three big sticks. One of the most visible moves was an economic blow. On November 19, Japan's Kyodo News and Nikkei reported, citing senior Japanese government sources, that China had officially notified Japan it was suspending imports of Japanese aquatic products. The official justification was a re-evaluation of the monitoring results of treated water at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. But both inside Japan's government and among international media, it was clear this was not a genuine continuation of the treated water issue, but retaliation aimed squarely at Takai's remarks about a survival crisis. The irony is that just earlier this month, Beijing had partially resumed imports of some Japanese marine products, and there had even been a small glimmer of easing tensions. Yet within days, the CCP performed another abrupt U-turn and reversed that decision. After targeting seafood, Beijing escalated from verbal intimidation to quasi-mandatory administrative interference in travel to Japan. At first, the authorities relied on a propaganda barrage. State media repeatedly magnified so-called security risks faced by Chinese citizens in Japan. But this empty scaremongering seemed to have little effect. Chinese tourists in Tokyo and Hokkaido were still shopping, soaking in hot springs, lining up for drugstores, and taking photos as usual. Faced with this reality, Beijing quietly shifted from propaganda to coercion. Starting in mid-November, many employees of state-owned enterprises received calls from their supervisors demanding that pre-approved vacations to Japan be cancelled. For example, an engineer at a state-owned company in Wuhan had received approval in October and already booked plane tickets and hotels for a late November trip to Osaka. On the 18th, his company's administrative office suddenly notified him that the situation has changed and the trip cannot go ahead. Fortunately, most of his travel expenses were refunded. But a male nurse at a public hospital in Beijing was not so lucky. He had applied earlier in the month for a weekend trip to Japan. After the Ministry of Culture and Tourism issued its risk warnings, his department head waved the document as a shield and forced him to cancel his trip. Nearly 6,000 yuan in non-refundable tickets and hotel fees were lost. For someone earning just over 4,000 yuan a month, this passive patriotism became a very real and painful cost. In other workplaces, supervisors simply sat on applications, neither approving nor directly rejecting them. At a state-run research institute in Beijing, one employee requested leave in December to travel to Japan. His boss refused to sign, nor did he formally deny the request. He just left the application in a drawer, sending a silent message, "Don't even think about going." At the same time, airlines became instruments of political control. Beginning November 15, state carriers such as Air China, China Eastern, and China Southern announced special refund and change policies, allowing year-end flights to Japan to be cancelled or rescheduled without fees. According to Chinese media reports, since these policies took effect, more than 490,000 tickets for Japan routes have been refunded, a refund wave larger than anything seen since the end of the pandemic. Meanwhile, some travelers posted online that flights they had booked for next March, from Sapporo's New Chitose Airport to Beijing, for example, were abruptly cancelled, with no alternative offered. One stranded passenger joked wryly, "The party has already cancelled it for you." That sentence quickly went viral on the Chinese internet, with sarcastic comments piling up under it. "If you cancel yourself, they owe you money. If the party cancels for you, you don't get a cent. Who dares go against the party? If the party really wants to go all the way, it might as well seal the borders again." Some people who managed to keep their tickets still couldn't escape pressure. One traveler shared on X that a friend received multiple calls from the airline, asking again and again whether there was a compelling reason to go to Japan. The tone sounded less like customer service and more like political interrogation. Others were stopped by customs officials at airports like Shanghai Pudong, Nanjing Lukou, and even in Hong Kong, and subjected to additional questioning simply because their destination was Japan. They were grilled about their jobs, reasons for travel, which city they were visiting, and how long they would stay, then forced into manual inspection channels for one more extra layer of hassle. If the earlier, "Please avoid traveling to Japan" messages could still be framed as propaganda and soft pressure, this new wave is unmistakably coercive. Workplaces won't let you go, airlines, helpfully, cancel for you, and customs tries to stop you before you reach the gate. In official language, all this is described as protecting citizens' safety. But for ordinary people who have lost their vacations and their hard-earned money, there is only one feeling: to vent the party's anger, their wallets and personal plans are sacrificed first. While tightening the screws on travel and trade, Beijing also turned up the heat militarily. On November 17, China began 3 days of live-fire drills in central waters of the Yellow Sea. Then on the 18th, it extended the drills to November 25, adding a new exercise zone in the southern Yellow Sea, with daily live-fire training from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. According to the announced coordinates, the new zone lies about 30 kilometers northeast of Lianyungang in Jiangsu province, roughly 870 kilometers from Japan's nearest outer islands, and only about 900 to 1,000 kilometers from Kyushu. The political signaling to Tokyo is unmistakable. In short, Beijing tried to rely on 3 major tools: verbal attacks, economic pressure, and military intimidation, to force Japan to back down. But what it got instead was a powerful backlash. On November 18, U.S. Ambassador to Japan Rahm Emanuel publicly criticized Beijing's actions as nothing like the behavior of a responsible major power, and pointedly added, "You don't want to buy Japanese seafood? That's fine, we in the United States will buy it." This was no mere joke. It was the first time the U.S. publicly stepped in to counter China's economic coercion against Japan in such direct terms. Emanuel's remarks quickly made headlines across Japanese TV networks and had a significant calming and rallying effect on public opinion in Japan, reassuring many that their country was not standing alone. Soon afterward, Singapore's Prime Minister Lawrence Wong also voiced support for Japan. Speaking at the Bloomberg New Economy Forum, he said that Singapore and other Southeast Asian countries support an expanded role for Japan in regional security, including on the front lines, as a contributor to stability. Among ASEAN leaders, Singapore's diplomatic language is typically cautious, so this clear message signals that even usually neutral Southeast Asian states see China as having gone too far this time. As such international support emerged, Japan's domestic politics also shifted in striking ways. Polls by NHK and the Sankei Shimbun showed that Takaichi's approval ratings rose sharply after the controversy, climbing to roughly 69%, while opposition to her dropped. Particularly noteworthy is that voters under 30 expressed higher support than older generations. Many young people said they felt Japan should more boldly and clearly express its national interests, and some said Takaichi's remarks were the first time they felt our country is no longer just passively taking hits. In other words, the CCP's attempt to suppress Japanese nationalism instead boosted Japan's own sense of identity and resolve. Beijing had hoped to pressure Takaichi into issuing an apology, retracting her statements, or even stepping down. But its heavy-handed tactics backfired, turning it into Takaichi's best campaign advertisement. The more aggressively the CCP attacked, the more the Japanese public rallied around her. One could say in a single line, Beijing thought it was punishing Japan, but ended up acting as Takaichi's most effective political promoter. This raises another key question: is there any legal basis for Beijing's hysterical reaction? From the Japanese government's perspective, Takaichi's statement that a Taiwan contingency could constitute a survival crisis for Japan is essentially an internal legal assessment within Japan's own security framework. It directly corresponds to the concept of a survival crisis situation defined in the 2015 security legislation, under which Japan may exercise its right to collective self-defense. That law is entirely part of Japan's domestic legal system and has nothing to do with recognizing Beijing's political narrative. Geographically, the distance between Taiwan and Japan is extremely short. Yonaguni Island, Japan's westernmost point, is only about 110 kilometers from Taiwan. Any conflict in the Taiwan Strait would directly impact Japanese territory, territorial waters, and airspace. Therefore, Takaichi's remarks are not alarmist nor baseless provocation, they are a sober assessment of Japan's own security risks, grounded in geography and existing law. On the level of international agreements, the 1972 joint communiqué that normalized relations between Japan and the People's Republic of China contains language stating that the Chinese side reiterates that Taiwan is an inalienable part of the territory of the People's Republic of China. The Japanese side fully understands and respects this position of the Chinese government. Crucially, the communiqué does not require Japan to recognize or accept this claim, nor does it include any clause prohibiting Japan from making its own security assessments regarding Taiwan. Japanese legal scholars generally interpret this as, Japan understands China's stance, but does not endorse it nor bind itself to it. In other words, Takaichi's comments on how a Taiwan conflict might affect Japan's security fall entirely within Japan's sovereign right to discuss and determine its own defense policy. There is no violation of the joint communiqué. For this reason, international media have widely questioned the CCP's protests, statements, and demands for retraction or resignation, seeing them clearly as acts of political coercion rather than legitimate diplomacy. Nonetheless, Beijing keeps framing the Taiwan issue as a core interest and an internal matter, and uses those labels to justify its escalating rhetoric. But behind those slogans lies a reality that Beijing cannot escape. It has never been able to anchor its demands in international law or binding treaties that could legally compel Japan to remain silent. Lacking solid legal grounds, Beijing leans heavily on nationalist mobilization and historical narratives, often dragging out documents like the Cairo Declaration to bolster its arguments. On November 16, the CCP's People's Daily ran an article invoking the Cairo Declaration, even hinting that it may be time to revisit the issue of the Ryukyu Islands. But anyone who has actually read the Cairo Declaration knows it states that Japan should restore to the Republic of China territories such as Taiwan. There is no mention of the People's Republic of China, which was founded years later. If that document were applied literally, Taiwan's sovereignty would be linked to the Republic of China, now based in Taiwan, not to the PRC in Beijing. The Republic of China still exists and continues to exercise effective control over Taiwan. This is an undeniable fact in today's world. Thus, whether seen from the perspectives of international law, historical documents, or Japanese domestic law, Takaichi's remarks stand on far firmer legal ground than Beijing's protests. The CCP's barrage of denunciations, threats, and sanctions is rooted in political calculation. When it cannot win on legal reasoning, it turns instead to nationalist agitation and diplomatic intimidation. Meanwhile, Japan's position has remained firm and consistent. There will be no apology and no retraction. From November 17 to 20, the Japanese government repeatedly emphasized in parliament and press conferences that Takaichi's remarks fully accord with Japan's security legislation and do not require any explanation or withdrawal to satisfy Beijing. Some officials explicitly stated that Japan has no reason whatsoever to bow to Chinese pressure. At the same time, the CCP's aggressive behavior has intensified nationalist sentiment within Japan, further boosting Takaichi's popularity. With the United States publicly backing Japan, Singapore signaling support, and Japanese citizens increasingly rallied behind their prime minister, Beijing finds itself in an extremely awkward position. It was Beijing that escalated the situation, broadened the scope of the dispute, and painted itself into a corner with its own rhetoric. Now Tokyo is not backing down. Washington and Southeast Asia show no intention of retreating either, and domestic nationalist fervor in China has been whipped into a frenzy by state propaganda. Under these circumstances, Beijing faces a dilemma. It cannot truly go to war with Japan, not only because of the U.S. Japan alliance but also because it would risk total strategic isolation. On the other hand, if it abruptly softens its stance, it will have to explain to its own populace why its chest-thumping nationalism suddenly evaporated. Questions of saving face, real strategic interests, domestic control, and international reputation are all entangled together. How will the CCP climb down from the tree it climbed so eagerly? Looking deeper, the China-Japan clash reveals an even more important underlying issue. Beijing is in the midst of testing and refining a dual-track strategy for Taiwan, what some analysts call Plan A and Plan B. Plan A is to force Taiwan into submission without firing a shot, using propaganda, psychological warfare, diplomatic isolation, and economic pressure. Plan B is the military option, preparing for a possible forced takeover. If we view the current conflict from this angle, Japan has actually become a spillover target of Beijing's Taiwan strategy. The Wall Street Journal, in a recent feature titled The Silent Glory, described how Beijing has been intensifying its cultural and narrative operations against Taiwan. It points to a series of measures, producing state-sponsored TV dramas and films that reshape wartime history and glorify communist agents, flooding Taiwan's media space with pro-Beijing narratives, deploying online troll armies and proxy media to spread pessimism, fear, and the message that resisting isn't worth it. The goal of all this, the article argues, is to make Taiwan surrender psychologically before any actual conflict. That is Beijing's no war, forced capitulation, Plan A. In parallel, the People's Liberation Army has been conducting constant gray zone operations, regular air and naval patrols around Taiwan, incursions into surrounding waters and airspace, and large-scale exercises that push the line of normalization ever closer to actual military confrontation. The journal notes that Beijing is trying to turn military pressure into background noise, so that future escalations will seem less shocking to the world. This is the preparation for Plan B, the military option. Seen in this light, the intense pressure on Japan is not an isolated episode but a side effect of a broader confrontation that centers on Taiwan. Takaichi's remark, that a Taiwan contingency could become a survival crisis for Japan, was, on its face, an internal Japanese assessment. Yet Beijing responded with its full trump card, a propaganda avalanche, economic attacks on tourism and seafood, and live-fire drills nudging toward Japan's doorstep. This response pattern looks almost identical to the CCP's usual modus operandi toward Taiwan. The escalation toward Japan thus sends a stark message: for Beijing, any government, whether in Taipei, Tokyo, or elsewhere, that dares to challenge its narrative about Taiwan will be treated with the same combined pressure of propaganda, economic punishment, and military intimidation. Japan is being used as an example. But in this case, Beijing ran into a hard wall. Takaichi did not fold. The US and Singapore lined up behind Japan. Japanese public opinion rallied rather than fractured. The usual pressure tactics, the pen and the gun, failed to produce the hoped-for submission. Instead, Beijing's strategy was exposed. If this China-Japan confrontation has a broader message, it is this: as we approach 2027, the Taiwan Strait will only grow more tense, not less. Each time Beijing extends its pressure outward, to Japan or beyond, it is, in a way, rehearsing for a larger crisis. And this time, its rehearsal has been met with firm resistance, and its weaknesses are becoming increasingly visible to the world.